Well, good morning, everyone. I can't tell you what a privilege it is to be able to speak with so many treasured colleagues and really creative, smart people who I esteem a lot. So thank you very much for this moment. What I'd like you to do, so what we're going to be doing is a meditation on method, as I'm calling it. Or paradoxically, we're going to try to learn a little bit about what we are not in order to be better what we are. So I'll start off with a kind of a Cohen-ish sort of statement. And I was thinking a lot about this image that Lev offered yesterday about the olive tree. This is a picture from Wikipedia, so I read up on olive trees a little bit last night. This one is 1,500 years old, and as late as 1975, they think there was an olive tree of life that may have dated back to Plato's Academy. So that's how long these things have been around. So altering something of this age is something that we can certainly think about. So I'd like to start with an exercise. I only have a few minutes here, so we have to do this very quickly. Right now, I want you to grab something to draw with. Right now, pull something out that you can draw with. It can be a piece of paper if you're a traditionalist. It can be your tablet, but don't spend a lot of time finding the app and then trying to figure out how the app works. Use the back of your hand if you need to, but quickly get something to draw with. 5 seconds, 4 seconds. All right. I'm going to give you each 30 seconds to draw a sunset. 30 seconds to draw a sunset. Go. On your piece of paper or whatever, draw a sunset. All right. So time's up. So I want you to hold those drawings just for a second. What I want to do this morning is to kind of build on the theme of wicked problems, which was introduced at this meeting last year. And I'm borrowing heavily from a couple of inspirations. One is this fellow, Alex Castrano, who's from IDEO, and he came and spoke at our fall online focus session and gave a very, very interesting talk, which I'm going to borrow heavily from right now. If you follow that URL down below, you can actually access the recording and listen to it. It's only 30 minutes. I really recommend you do so. It's very, very interesting. Anyone know who this is? John Cleese. Believe it or not, he's also a source I'm going to be drawing on at this moment because he has a very interesting talk on creativity that you can find on YouTube. So I'm going to be drawing from both these folks in the course of my remarks this morning. So now let's return to those drawings. Take a look at those drawings you just did. And how many of you, I want you to raise your hand if your drawing was mostly like this one, with the sun going down behind the land or the sea, maybe some birds or clouds. Raise your hand. Look around, everyone. Keep your hands up. Everyone look around. And see, the vast majority of us did what? We produced the same drawing. So the question is, are we just a bunch of uncreative lunks who can't think of anything better? I submit that it's not the right conclusion. This might be, you say, this is a more creative way of drawing a sunset with maybe the sun going behind the earth, but why couldn't we do this just now? Or why did so many of us not do this right now? The interesting thing is that when Alex did it with his colleagues at IDEO, and you think of IDEO engineers and designers as being extremely creative people, they did the same thing. Look at all these drawings that they did. They're all the same basic same drawing done over and over again. What is going on here? I think what's going on is not so much that we're uncreative lunks, but rather notice the way I set this up. I said you have 30 seconds. First, you only have 15 seconds to find something to do it with. Find your medium in 15 seconds. And then I said you only have 30 seconds to do this drawing. When we are constrained in that way, what do? We go with what's known. We repeat what we've learned. So this is an important clue already from this exercise that if we're going to get onto a type of thinking that really tries to address wicked problems, there's a problem if the constraints are too great. So from this exercise, I would make the following conclusions. One, that an overemphasis on efficiency and quick turnaround tend to produce standard and in-the-box ideas. We just saw this right now. Second, if you operate in an environment where you can't afford to fail, your productions, your thoughts, your thinking, your products are going to be conservative and tend to be fairly standard and in the box. And third, we can draw a conclusion that out-of-the-box thinking requires an environment that is conducive to it, one that is not normal, an environment that we might say is out of the box. So when we think about creative thinking and actually tackling wicked problems, we need to think about our environments. We need to think about our context. There's a reason why design workshops like this are messy with lots of cuttings on the floor. I think it's Tim Brown at IDEO who said that regulation-sized offices produce regulation-sized ideas. So let's do a refresher course. This was this notion of wicked problems, and here are the characteristics last year that I sort of called out as being key, what distinguishes a wicked problem from others. One is that the feeling that this problem or this challenge is unlike any other you've ever dealt with before. Two, that the problem itself is very complex and ambiguous. It's not terribly clear-cut. Third, you can't just write a check. You can't just do business as usual in order to really address it in any fundamental or satisfactory way. Fourth, the definition of a wicked problem is itself a wicked problem, as we can see. It requires a kind of disruptive or out-of-the-box thinking to hope to make sense or make progress when facing or dealing with a wicked challenge or problem. And that each solution that you begin to propose in the context of trying to solve this wicked problem creates a new problem or widens the problem or changes the whole context. And finally, when you look at this challenge and you think, to do this, we need something really new. You can think about climate change or something of that scale. We need a really new approach in order to be able to challenge some of these problems. And I suggested that the design thinking process is the ideal methodology for coming to grips with this, because you know it has a two-step process that is characteristic of it. One in which you open the horizon and you try to collect ideas and prototype, and then a second stage in which you begin to select or prune back all that and select on the ideas to go forward with. So there's a divergent stage and then a convergent stage. So now I'd like to go and bring in John Cleese, because he has some interesting notions about creativity, because I think at its core, design thinking and the thinking that's needed to challenge wicked problems is itself creative thinking. So John mentions that he says the first thing, and he actually went and talked to some psychologists at Berkeley and caught up in the research, so he knows a bit of what he's talking about. And his first point was that creativity is not something that's inborn. It's not like, for some of us with blonde hair, some with dark hair. It really is a way of operating. And that's very encouraging, because that means if we change our way of operating, we can increase our creativity and come to grips with these problems in a more productive way. Now, John makes a distinction between what he calls, first on the one hand, a closed mode of operating. This is, we got to get a lot of stuff done. We feel we're in this mode that we're at work, and he uses that word very deliberately. We're at work when we're in this mode. That we feel maybe a little bit anxious, we're pressed because there are important things we have to do, there are lots of things we have to do, there are deadlines we have to meet. It's very purposeful, but in a narrow sense. I have all these things I have to get done, they're on my plate. He contrasts this with what he calls an open mode, where we're relaxed, expansive, exploratory, curious, playful, and of course for John, humor is a very important part of that. He gives this example. If it's 1928 and you're a scientist of Scottish descent and you're in a laboratory and you're trying to grow bacteria in petri dishes, and you notice that in one of your dishes that you left open by mistake, there's this mold growing in and all the bacteria have died, in the closed mode, you throw it away. If you're in the open mode, you stop and say, I wonder what this might be. And of course, this is penicillin. This is how penicillin was noticed for the first time, and it was suggested that it might be an effective antibacterial agent. So additional Cleesian notions about creativity. When you're in the open mode, when you're in the divergent mode of design thinking, you never want to say no. You never want to say wrong. You never want to say, I don't like that. And you also never want to say, that will never work. And the other thing he points out that I thought was very intriguing was that the creative person can tolerate uncertainty longer than others. He talked about comparing himself to someone else he felt more creative, but he felt he was more productive. And he felt this was the key characteristic, that his colleague tended to shut things down prematurely, whereas he could kind of tolerate the uncertainty a little bit longer and tease out more options and more ideas out of what he was doing. So that's point number one. So I want to shift gears now a little bit and very quickly return to Alex, because I think he has another very, very important point for us here. Typically, it's thought that disruptive thinking is antithetical to sustaining thinking. Kind of like chess pieces. It's one against the other, it's black or white. Alex suggests that's not the case. And he maps out this way of thinking about what you do as an organization. You have core products and services or core services that you produce for a standard audience. And then he talks about an evolutionary layer, in which either you think about new audience for your current products, or new products for your current audience, or then what he calls the really revolutionary step, in which you're seeking to invent or find new audiences and invent whole new products. And he suggests that when you distribute resources in all of these, this is what you should do. 70% should go into your core services, about 20% perhaps into evolutionary projects and ideas, and then maybe another 10% for the really disruptive ones. He also points out that we know what the failure rate for all disruptive ideas is. It's very, very high, well over 90%. So his point is that you go to that 10% and you invest in that 10% of disruptive thinking, not so much because you're going to hit a home run. Very few of us invent the iPhone. But instead, the learning that happens when doing that 10% of thinking feeds the core, feeds all the other aspects of your operation and your group. And that's the value. The value is the learning that happens when you're in that 10% space. So his notions here, to sum up very quickly, is the health of your core activities is not antithetical to disruptive thinking, but in fact is nurtured by the learning that happens in it. Evolutionary thinking is about either new audiences or new services, or truly disruptive thinking is about both, new audiences and new services. And that the value of that disruptive 10% of activity that you do is that it feeds the core. Learning happens there, and the core benefits by that learning. Obvious example here is Apple. This is actually a bad example because what they did was to hit that home run. But if you go back to Alex's thinking and try to map what Apple has accomplished, the iOS part of there, which they started with, remember the original iPod with the wheel? That was a sidelight. But it was able to now, we've gotten to the point where now what they're doing in the iOS space informs the evolution of the Mac operating system. So we're seeing already that what happened in the disruptive side is now moving and informing what's happening on the core services. In fact, to the point now, we know in the case of Apple, you could argue that Mac OS is now moving to the edge, and that iOS perhaps is the core service. But be that as it may, the point here is that the learning that happened out in the disruptive space came back and served the core as well. So this notion of an antithesis between the two, I think, is perhaps somewhat superficial or too casual. In the case of higher education, we all know that MOOCs are out there. We're wondering what the relationship is going to be from the MOOCs. Is MOOCs are going to totally tear apart traditional higher education apart and make it in the past? I think what we're seeing already, and this is happening very, very quickly, and I'm sure you would agree with me, is that indeed what's happening is that the MOOC is beginning to inform the core practice of higher education in precisely the same way. One way this is happening is that faculty who teach in this new environment come back to their traditional courses and say, gee, I could borrow from what I just did because it will work here as well. But also, schools are experimenting with now making the MOOC as part of their standard curriculum, perhaps through a flipped classroom model or something like that. So again, what we see is that disruptive thinking informing what's happening at the core and helping to shape its evolution as well. The learning that happens outside informs, in a sense, what's happening now inside. So I'm going to wrap up here and just kind of draw a few last conclusions that I hope will help us when we go to thinking about the Shark Tank and other sorts of ideas that are challenging us that we can come back to. So first, I would say that if we're going to arm wrestle with wicked problems, we're going to need a methodology and an environment that is conducive that will help us do that. And that is creative thinking. And creative thinking just doesn't happen by itself. It doesn't happen to just a few people who happen to be lucky enough to be creative people. It happens to all of us. But creative thinking, by that notion, is something that is freely available to all of us. However, it's fragile. The conditions for it aren't very common. In fact, what Larry and NMC have done right here to draw us away from our work, to have a retreat, to think about these things is exactly what you need to do in order to foster that kind of thinking. And in a certain sense, us reading email while we're trying to be creative is sort of shooting ourselves in the foot, if you think about it a little bit. Also, another implication here is that leadership is really key to unlocking the creative potential and the creative thinking in a group. That the leader needs to think about ways of setting up these environments and these contexts for the people on the team so that they can allow these types of creative ideas, these creative talents, these creative strengths that they have to really come to bear on the challenges that are facing us. And finally, that creative thinking results in learning, that it's not something that's happening on the fringe. You know, classically, R&D groups have been problematic because everyone says, oh yeah, those people get to play. They're not responsible for doing anything. They bring no benefit, and here we're toiling here in the core. So this notion that that learning happens in this 10% kind of disrupts that stereotype and says, no, everybody participates in that 10%, and everybody can bring that back into the fold. That learning that happens can be imported back into the core in a way that encourages us all and helps everything to move forward. And that's it. Thank you very much.